Did medieval peasants actually travel? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter, muddier world. The Middle Ages. A time when people lived by the rhythm of the seasons, when the word vacation didn't exist, and when travel meant blisters, rain, and probably a goat nibbling your cloak. So, if your blanket's tucked in, the lights are low, and you're ready to let your mind wander. But not too fast. We're going to explore something that might surprise you, because there's this common image, isn't there? That medieval peasants never went anywhere, that they were tied to their little patch of dirt from birth to death, never venturing beyond the church steeple in the next village over. And, like most things people assume about the past, that's both true and not true at the same time. So let's start walking, slowly, carefully, through the rutted roads and winding paths of 1,000 years ago, and find out how far the average medieval person might have gone. And why. The myth of the immovable peasant, the idea of the medieval peasant as a rooted creature, born, lived and died in one place, is a strong one. It's in paintings, novels, and almost every movie that involves someone wearing wool and carrying a hoe. And sure, for many people, life was local. You were born in a small village. You worked on someone else's land. You went to church. You grew old. You died. The end. But reality, as usual, was messier. Because while most peasants didn't go gallivanting across Europe for fun, they did move. For work, for religion, for survival. And sometimes, just because they felt like it. There's something deeply human about that. The urge to move, even when the odds, the church, and the mud are against you. The roads, or what passed for them. Before we go anywhere, we need to talk about the roads, because medieval roads were ambitious. Some were old Roman ones, still clinging to existence centuries after the empire collapsed. Solid, straight, paved with ancient engineering brilliance. But most were not. They were dirt paths, often flooded, deeply rutted by wagon wheels, and frequented by more animals than people. In wet seasons, they turned into bogs. In dry ones, they baked into uneven stone. So, traveling anywhere, even a few miles, was slow, uncomfortable, and, occasionally, dangerous. If you've ever stepped into a puddle wearing socks, you already know 80% of the medieval travel experience. And yet, people still went. Local wanderers. Let's start small, with the local journeys. Medieval peasants regularly traveled to nearby markets, usually within a few miles of home. They sold eggs, bought tools, or bartered for salt, wool, or ale. Market days were social events, a break from isolation, a chance to gossip, meet relatives, or hear news from travelers. You might walk half a day each way just to buy something as glamorous as onions. But it wasn't nothing. It was movement. And then there were fairs. Bigger, louder, more chaotic versions of the market. People might travel 10, 20, or even 30 miles to attend one, sometimes staying overnight in makeshift tents or barns. So no, medieval peasants weren't exactly world travelers, but they did travel regionally, regularly, and with purpose. Marriage, work, and moving around. Then there's the matter of work. Because contrary to the image of a man permanently chained to his lord's field, medieval laborers could, and did move for better opportunities. By the 12th and 13th centuries, as towns grew, they needed builders, blacksmiths, weavers, and millers. And peasants with useful skills could find work there, for wages. Sometimes lords even encouraged movement, offering temporary freedom to skilled workers. The result was a surprisingly mobile class of semi-peasants, semi-laborers, wandering between estates, towns, and cities. Marriage also caused movement. In many villages, people didn't marry their next-door neighbors. They married someone from a neighboring parish, 5 or 10 miles away, which meant you might move permanently to your spouse's home. For a world often described as static, medieval life involved a quiet but steady churn of motion. Not glamorous motion, perhaps, but human motion. Pilgrimage, the medieval road. Trip now. We come to the most famous kind of medieval travel: pilgrimage. If there was ever a socially acceptable excuse to pack a bag and leave home for months, this was it. Pilgrimage was travel with holy branding. You weren't wandering aimlessly. You were saving your soul. From tiny local shrines to grand destinations like Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or even Jerusalem, pilgrims crisscrossed medieval Europe in astonishing numbers. Some went for penance. Some went for healing. Some, honestly, went because it sounded like an adventure. A farmer might walk from England to Spain with little more than a staff and a good pair of shoes, stopping at monasteries and inns along the way. A widow might join a group of neighbors on a journey to see a relic of a saint's finger. And of course, there were professional pilgrims, people who'd go on your behalf if you couldn't afford the time or danger. You'd pay them, they'd walk for you, and everyone pretended it counted. It was, in many ways, medieval outsourcing. The infrastructure of faith pilgrimage routes were the closest thing medieval Europe had to a travel network. Monasteries and abbeys lined the main paths, offering food and shelter for travelers. Hospices were built at mountain passes. Markets sprang up along the routes. Over time, these paths became arteries of commerce and communication. Merchants, soldiers, and scholars used the same roads as pilgrims, creating a world that was far more connected than we tend to imagine. It's one of history's quiet ironies. Religion, so often associated with stability, was also one of the great forces that made people move. The wanderers, vagabonds, and outsiders, of course. Not all travelers were respectable. Some were wanderers by necessity, beggars, outlaws, or those displaced by war or famine. Medieval Europe was full of these rootless people, drifting from place to place, unwelcome almost everywhere. Laws were harsh against vagabonds. In some regions, just being found on the road without a good reason could get you whipped or worse. But still, they roamed. Because when your field failed, or your lord raised your rent, or the plague emptied your village, the road was all that was left. They were the forgotten movers of medieval life, people who lived in the in-between, surviving on luck and stubbornness. The Crusades, mass movement, medieval style, and then, of course, there were the Crusades. When you think about large-scale medieval travel, it doesn't get bigger or more chaotic than tens of thousands of people marching east in the name of God, and often plunder. The First Crusade alone saw farmers, knights, nobles, and peasants alike trekking thousands of miles from France, Germany, and England to the Holy Land. Most didn't make it. Many had no idea where they were going. Maps were vague, the logistics non-existent, and enthusiasm was often inversely proportional to competence. But they went. Entire villages sometimes emptied out. It was a medieval migration on a scale Europe wouldn't see again for centuries. And while the Crusades were drenched in blood and politics, they also changed Europe in quieter ways. Trade expanded, knowledge flowed back, and the world suddenly seemed a bit larger. Trade and the traveling merchant. While peasants trudged through mud and pilgrims trudged through faith, another group was moving for profit, the merchants. By the 13th century, trade networks stretched from England to Italy, from Scandinavia to Constantinople. You had English wool merchants sailing to Flanders, Venetian traders dealing in spices from the east, and Hanseatic merchants hauling timber, amber, and fish across the North and Baltic seas. For the first time in centuries, Europe was connected by something more powerful than kings or crusades: commerce. Even peasants felt it. Goods, money, and ideas filtered down through markets and fairs, carried by men and women who had seen more of the world than most nobles ever would. The boundaries of a peasant's world. So how far did the average peasant go? Probably not more than 20 miles from home in their entire lifetime. But here's the thing. That was enough. In a world without maps, without trains, and without reliable shoes, 20 miles was a lot. It meant new dialects, new customs, sometimes even a new legal system. And it wasn't just about distance, it was about connection. Because every person who walked to a market, or a shrine, or a neighboring village, carried news, gossip, and stories. And those stories traveled further than the people did. Information was medieval Europe's most mobile commodity. The human constant. So, yes, medieval peasants did travel, not in the way we do now, with passports and planes and overpriced airport coffee, but in a slower, humbler, often more meaningful way. They moved for love, for work, for worship, for survival. And in doing so, they kept the world turning, step by muddy step. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? To know that even in a world of hardship and limitation, people still found reasons to move. They still got curious. They still looked over the next hill and thought, I wonder what's there. So as you lie there now, perhaps drifting a little yourself, think of those travelers, tired, cold, determined, walking beneath the same moon that still hangs above us tonight. Their world was smaller, but their footsteps echo further than we think. And maybe, just maybe, they remind us that every journey, even one made barefoot through the mud, starts the same way, by wanting to see what's beyond the horizon. What did people do with bodies before cemeteries existed? Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before cemeteries, before neat rows of marble headstones, before lawn mowers and Sunday visits, and those tasteful little flower vases that always tip over in the wind. We're going back to when death was not something that happened over there, fenced off, landscaped, and tidily signposted. It happened right here, in your home, in your village. sometimes in your garden, and occasionally directly under your kitchen floor. So, settle in, dim the lights, and let's talk about what humanity used to do with its dead before someone finally said, "Maybe we should organize this." The first burials. When death was still an experiment, the earliest humans didn't have cemeteries because they didn't really have anything. No towns, no fences, just a few good rocks, and, if you were lucky, a mammoth bone or two. When someone died, early humans did what most animals do. They left the body behind. It sounds cold, but to them it was practical. Carrying a corpse around the tundra wasn't great for morale. Then, somewhere around 100,000 years ago, something changed. Someone decided to dig a hole. Not for storage, or shelter, or food, but for another person. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal burials where the dead were laid carefully, sometimes with tools or flowers. Yes, flowers. Imagine that. A Neanderthal gently arranging wild blooms around a companion's body. It's oddly tender for a species we often picture clubbing things for fun, so even before civilization, people already felt that strange tug. That the dead shouldn't just lie there. They needed somewhere to belong. Let's drift to the Neolithic. Homes for the dead, by the time farming began, death had moved indoors. Literally. In Neolithic Europe and the Near East, it was common to bury the dead under the house. Under the packed earth floor, right below where the living slept, cooked, and argued about goats. Children, especially, were often interred beneath thresholds or hearths. It wasn't as grim as it sounds. They believed it kept the family close together. A kind of spiritual insulation. When a new generation moved in, they didn't clear the graves. They just packed on more floor layers. Your great-great-grandmother might have been directly beneath your bed, and nobody thought that was strange. The idea of resting in peace hadn't been invented yet. Peace, as far as prehistory was concerned, was everyone stacked neatly underfoot. The megalithic tombs, stone houses for the permanently homebound. Then came the great stone tombs, the dolmens, passage graves, and cairns scattered across Europe like enormous, confusing art installations. Take Newgrange in Ireland. Built. Around 3200 BCE. It's older than the pyramids, and it's basically a giant stone womb. A circular mound with a long tunnel leading into a dark chamber. Once a year, on the winter solstice, sunlight travels down that passage and illuminates the inner room. It wasn't for a person. It was for people. Whole communities returned their bones there, mixed together. A kind of ancestral soup. To us, that sounds impersonal. To them, individuality wasn't the point. You didn't go to heaven. You became part of the place. The hill, the stones, the earth. The idea of one grave per person would have seemed almost wasteful. Imagine explaining to a Neolithic farmer that you planned to reserve a private plot forever. He'd probably blink at you, shovel in hand, and say, "Why? You'll be dust in a week." Egypt, the land that never let go. And then there were the Egyptians. If prehistory was about letting go, Egypt was about never letting go at all. They mummified the body, painted the face, filled the tomb with snacks, and wrote explicit instructions for eternity, just in case the soul got lost. The Egyptian afterlife was like an eternal bureaucratic journey. You needed paperwork, supplies, and, ideally, a backup plan. Ordinary Egyptians couldn't afford pyramids, but even the poor tried to preserve something: a shroud, an amulet, a jar of beer. It was all about continuity. To them, cemeteries weren't places of decay. They were logistical hubs for eternity. And yes, the mummification process involved pulling your brain out through your nose. But you'll be relieved to know that was reserved for the wealthy. Most people just dried out quietly in the desert. Greece and Rome. Elegance, ash, and a bit of theft. When civilization moved west, the Greeks and Romans introduced a new concept: aesthetic mourning. Greeks burned their dead on pyres, collecting the ashes in urns. They built family tombs outside city walls, turning the approach roads into open-air sculpture galleries. The message was subtle. Yes, we're dead, but we're still very tasteful about it. Romans took that idea and industrialized it. They had entire streets of tombs, carved with flattering portraits and long, rambling epitaphs. Some even included benches, so visitors could picnic with their ancestors. Of course, not everyone could afford marble. Poor Romans joined collegia funeraticea, funeral clubs. You paid a monthly fee, and when you died, the club guaranteed you'd get at least a decent burial. Basically, the world's first group life insurance with urn storage. But when the empire fell, so did its infrastructure. The roads, the tombs, the neat organization, all gone, and Europe drifted back into something more intimate and improvised. Early Christians sleeping with the saints. The early Christians had an unusual relationship with death. They believed the body was temporary, but also sacred, a vessel awaiting resurrection. So they couldn't just leave it lying around. They started using catacombs, underground tunnels filled with neatly stacked bodies. If you're picturing something spooky, you're right. But at the time, these were peaceful places, softly lit, echoing with prayers, and surprisingly well organized. Christians wanted to be buried near martyrs, literally as close as possible, like celestial networking. The idea was that when Judgment Day came, proximity to holiness might get you a better seat in heaven. It's not unlike buying an expensive plot near a celebrity today, just with more Latin inscriptions and fewer flower arrangements. Let's drift to the Middle Ages, the Great Churchyard Era. By the 9th century, the practice of burying people in churchyards had spread across Europe. If you were Christian, you wanted to be in consecrated ground. preferably right next to the church. The closer to the altar, the holier the soil. This created a problem: space. Churchyards filled up fast. When there wasn't enough room, the older bones were quietly removed and stacked in ossuaries. Imagine walking through a small village in medieval France. The churchyard might have served the same families for 500 years. Every grave had been used, reused, and occasionally borrowed by accident. You might see the same femur 3 or 4 times in a lifetime, just wearing a different name each time. It wasn't disrespectful. It was practical. The body was temporary. The soul permanent. The grave was simply storage. The smell of sanctity. Of course, this arrangement came with one slight issue: the smell. Medieval burials weren't always deep or well sealed. Churchyards were crowded, often on sloping ground where rainwater did unhelpful things. And remember, people were buried in simple shrouds, not airtight coffins. Accounts from the 14th century mention churchyards so full that bones pushed up from the ground after heavy rain, which is an image that pairs beautifully with a lullaby, I know. Yet people loved being buried there, because the churchyard wasn't just a graveyard, it was a social hub. Markets, fairs, and meetings took place between the tombs. You might buy bread, gossip with neighbors, and step over your uncle on the way home. Death was woven into daily life, not something hidden behind stone walls, but part of the scenery. The plague years. When the system collapsed, then came the Black Death in the 14th century. Europe's population dropped by half, and so did the available burial space. In London alone, thousands died weekly. Churchyards overflowed, so people dug mass graves layered with lime to quicken decomposition. It sounds horrific, but there was no other choice. The living were too few and too tired to mourn properly. Many of those plague pits still lie beneath modern cities, quiet layers of history under parks and offices. They weren't marked, because everyone already knew what they were. They were the memory no one wanted to write down. A moment to breathe. Why we needed cemeteries? By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe had outgrown its graveyards. Bodies decayed poorly in city soil. Water tables rose, and diseases followed. It became clear that holiness alone wasn't a great sanitation policy. Doctors began quietly suggesting that maybe burying people next to your drinking water wasn't ideal. Governments agreed, reluctantly, and thus began the slow invention of the cemetery, a place designed for burial, separate from the living, clean, landscaped, and, above all, organized. But that's for later. For now, let's stay with the messy, crowded centuries when the dead still lived among the living. The hidden burials, under houses, behind walls even. After cemeteries became law, people kept up older habits. In rural areas, family members were still buried on private land. Farmers might inter their dead in gardens, orchards, or under favorite trees. In the Balkans, it was common to place the body at the edge of a field, close enough to watch over the crops. In parts of Scandinavia, early Christians built churches directly on top of pagan graves, not to erase them, just to keep the neighbors close. The entire underworld explained, Hades' realm. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to the soft shadows of the ancient world. The kind where gods ruled from mountaintops. Mortals tried not to get noticed, and the afterlife was less pearly gates and more mildly depressing cave system. So if you're tucked in, lights dimmed, and your blanket is just right, we're heading somewhere deep, quiet, and timeless. Somewhere beneath everything, the Greek underworld, a place ruled by Hades, misunderstood, underappreciated, and probably in need of a good therapist. Now, don't worry. There's no jump scares here. No fire, no brimstone, no Dante-style dramatics. The Greek underworld wasn't a horror movie. It was bureaucracy with ghosts. A little gloomy, a little dusty, but mostly orderly. So let's take this slowly. Let's drift down through the myths, the mists, and the mildly unfair metaphysics of the afterlife. Because, like most things in Greek mythology, it's both absurd and deeply human at the same time. The descent, according to the Greeks, the journey to the underworld began the same way most journeys do, with a death. One moment you were at dinner, probably eating olives and gossiping about your neighbor's goat. The next, you were a shade, a pale, fluttering remnant of yourself. Your family would wash and prepare your body, dress you in your best robes, and place a coin, usually an obol, under your tongue or over your eyes. That was your fare for the ferryman, Charon, because the afterlife, like everything else in ancient Greece, came with service fees. Charon was not a cheerful man. He ferried souls across the river Styx, or sometimes the Acheron, depending on which poet you asked, in his creaky, eternally damp boat. He didn't take tips. He didn't smile. He didn't like small talk. If you didn't have your coin, you weren't getting in. Instead, your shade was left to wander the shore. The ghostly equivalent of being stuck outside a nightclub with no cover charge. The rivers themselves were not pleasant. There were 5 in total, because the Greeks loved a good list. There was the Styx, the river of hatred, the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, the Acheron, river of sorrow, the Phlegethon, river of fire, not the cozy kind, and Cocytus, the river of wailing, which sounds like a fun Saturday night. They surrounded and divided the underworld into its various regions, each one serving a purpose, like departments in an eternal civil service. Arriving in the underworld, once you crossed the river, assuming Charon didn't throw you overboard, you'd arrive at the gates of the underworld, guarded by Cerberus. You've probably seen him. Big dog, 3 heads, occasionally drawn with snakes for a mane. He wasn't there to attack newcomers. His job was to keep the living out and the dead in. Basically, ancient Greece's most intimidating doorman. Once you passed him, and you really hoped you did, you'd find yourself in the asphodel meadows. Now, meadow sounds nice, right? Flowers, sunshine, maybe some light harp music? No. This was the ancient Greek version of purgatory. Endless gray plains where ordinary souls drifted around forever, doing absolutely nothing, not suffering, not rejoicing, just existing. It was the eternal after-party for mediocrity. Heroes, of course, got better accommodations, but we'll get to them later. Hades himself, before we wander too far. Let's talk about the landlord, Hades. Now, Hades gets a bad reputation, mostly because people conflate him with death. But he's not the Grim Reaper. That's Thanatos. Hades doesn't go around collecting souls. He just manages them once they arrive. He's more of an administrator than a villain. Imagine an immortal accountant with a strong sense of order and no sense of humor. He didn't ask for the underworld. It was assigned to him after the great cosmic inheritance split. When Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades divided the universe, Zeus took the sky. Because, of course he did. Poseidon got the sea, which suited his temperament perfectly, and Hades got the leftovers, the underworld. He didn't complain much, but you can imagine the family dinners after that. Still, Hades took pride in his realm. He ruled it with fairness, if not warmth. He wasn't cruel, just detached. In fact, by mythological standards, he was probably one of the more responsible gods, which tells you a lot about the company he kept. He had a palace down there, carved from black stone, and decorated in an aesthetic somewhere between eternal gloom and respectable goth. He also had a wife, Persephone, though wife might be a generous term for someone who was, technically, abducted. Persephone and the compromise. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of grain and harvest. One day, while she was picking flowers, Hades saw her, fell instantly in love, or whatever the divine equivalent of infatuation is, and decided to kidnap her. The ground opened up, his chariot burst out, and he whisked her away to the underworld before anyone could stop him. It was not a great first date. Demeter, understandably, was furious. She searched the earth, neglecting her crops, and soon famine spread across the land. Eventually, Zeus had to intervene, mostly because the humans were starving, and that meant fewer sacrifices. A deal was struck. Persephone could return to the surface for part of the year, but because she'd eaten a few pomegranate seeds while in the underworld, 6, depending on the version, she was bound to return for 6 months each year. And that, according to the Greeks, is why we have seasons. When Persephone is above ground, her mother rejoices, and the world blooms. When she returns to Hades, Demeter mourns, and everything dies. It's one of those myths that's both poetic and slightly dysfunctional, like most family stories. The bureaucracy of death now. Once a soul was officially processed. And yes, it really was that bureaucratic. It had to face judgment. The Greeks had 3 judges of the dead: Rhadamanthus, Minos, and Aeacus. Each one was a former mortal king, promoted after death. The divine equivalent of, "Congratulations, you've been promoted to eternal paperwork." They would review your life, weighing your deeds, and assign you a destination. If you'd lived a heroic or virtuous life, you were sent to the Elysian fields, the Greek version of paradise. There, the air was sweet, the fields golden, and heroes spent eternity chatting, drinking, and generally enjoying themselves. It was peaceful, not ecstatic, eternal comfort, not endless pleasure. If you'd been evil, however, you went to Tartarus, and that was less nice. Tartarus, where the gods dump their problems. Tartarus wasn't technically part of the underworld. It was beneath it. If the underworld was a basement, Tartarus was the crawl space under the basement that everyone pretends doesn't exist. It was a place of punishment, both for mortals and immortals. The Titans, who had challenged the Olympian gods, were imprisoned there. So were assorted wrongdoers, liars, oath-breakers, and cosmic nuisances. The punishments were creative, if repetitive. Sisyphus, for example, was condemned to roll a boulder up a hill forever. And every time he got close to the top, it rolled back down. He'd tried to cheat death twice, and Hades took that personally. Then there was Tantalus, who stood in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree, forever thirsty and hungry. Every time he reached for food or drink, it slipped away. Hence the word tantalizing. You're welcome. Ixion was strapped to a flaming wheel that spun for eternity, which feels excessive. But the Greeks never did subtlety well. The other rivers, if Tartarus was eternal punishment, the Lethe was eternal forgetfulness. The souls who drank from it lost all memory of their mortal lives. Poets loved this detail, the idea that before rebirth, souls had to forget everything that came before. In a way, it was merciful, because remembering, eternity would drive anyone mad. Some versions of the myth-said philosophers and mystics tried to avoid the Lethe entirely, believing memory was key to breaking the cycle of rebirth, so even in death, there were loopholes for the ambitious. Elysium and the Isles of the Blessed for the rarest souls, heroes, poets, demigods. There was an upgrade, the Isles of the Blessed. Essentially, Elysium on premium mode. Only those who had been reborn 3 times and lived virtuous lives each time could get there. It was the closest the Greeks ever came to a true heaven. The air there was perfect, the sea calm, and the company exclusive. Achilles, Orpheus, and a few lucky philosophers supposedly ended up there. If there was gossip, it must have been excellent. Life goes on down there. For everyone else, the underworld wasn't torture, just endless existence. You'd wander, pale and soundless, through the meadows of asphodel. Sometimes you'd meet old friends, sometimes you wouldn't recognize them at all. the living would visit occasionally. Heroes, poets, nosy relatives. Odysseus famously descended to ask for directions. Orpheus came looking for his wife. Heracles dropped by on an errand and wrestled Cerberus, because apparently he couldn't help himself, and Hades watched it all with weary patience, because in his realm everything stayed the same. The living rushed through their brief, noisy lives above, while below, eternity drifted on, gray, quiet, unchanging. So as you lie there now, maybe half asleep, think of that underworld, not as a place of punishment, but as a mirror, a quiet reflection of life itself, endless, strange, sometimes dull, but deeply human. And if you listen closely, in that space between waking and sleep, you might just hear the faint lap of the Styx, the soft bark of Cerberus, and the sigh of 1,000 souls waiting for dawn that never comes. How did medieval people deal with bad smells? The fragrance of civilization. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time before soap was a household word, before plumbing, before anyone had the faintest idea what bacteria were doing down there in the gutter. You might want to light a candle for this. Something floral, maybe lavender. You'll need it, because tonight we're talking about how medieval people dealt with bad smells. Now, to be fair, people have always smelled. It's one of those unavoidable side effects of being alive. But for the medieval world, smell wasn't just a mild inconvenience. It was part of the landscape, a sensory background noise, like birdsong or church bells. The medieval city was an orchestra of odors, and not the nice kind. Let's start by imagining the air. If you lived in a city like London, Paris, or Florence around the year 1300, you would have been surrounded by a constant low-level funk, a mixture of animal dung, smoke, sweat, and the sweet, choking stench of rot. People lived cheek by jowl with their refuse. They didn't just throw it out. They threw it down, sometimes out the window, sometimes directly into the street, sometimes just a few inches from where they ate dinner. The word gutter had not yet met the concept of functioning, and yet, somehow, they thought this was all fine. To medieval people, smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was moral. A foul odor meant sin, corruption, or decay. A sweet one meant virtue, cleanliness, and divine favor. So when things started to reek, and they always did, people reached for remedies that were spiritual as much as physical. And spoiler, most of them didn't work. The nose knew. Sort of. The medieval nose was considered a diagnostic tool. Doctors used it the way modern doctors use thermometers, sniffing, quite literally, for signs of imbalance. Bad smells meant bad air, and bad air meant disease. They called it miasma, or corrupted air. To medieval people, illness didn't come from invisible germs, but from invisible vapors rising from filth and stagnant water. If a street smelled rotten, that smell was thought to be physically poisoning you. which, to be fair, wasn't completely wrong. If you're living next to a medieval cesspit, something is poisoning you. They just couldn't see what. And so they tried to fix the smell. Instead of the sanitation, they burned herbs, wore pomanders, carried perfumed gloves, and sprinkled rose water on everything that didn't move. Sometimes even on things that did. But before we get into the fragrances of survival, let's set the scene a little more vividly. The city that never washed. Take medieval Paris. A beautiful city from a distance. Up close, it was a perfume-free disaster. The narrow streets were made of mud and animal waste, layered over centuries. Open sewers ran alongside them, choked with garbage. And because people rarely bathed, partly out of modesty, partly out of logistics, the human contribution to the overall bouquet was substantial. In 1184, the French king actually had to issue an order forbidding butchers from dumping offal directly into the Seine, which implies that up until then, it was considered normal. You might think people would have been desperate to clean things up. They weren't. They'd become accustomed to the smell. It was simply the smell of living. Chachatitur from rural areas, however, did complain. There are letters from foreign clerics describing Paris as a fair city, shining from afar, yet filled with abominable odors, which, in medieval terms, is the equivalent of a one-star Yelp review. The great debate. To bathe or not to bathe bathing in the Middle Ages is one of those topics that tends to attract extremes. You often hear that medieval people never bathed, which isn't true. They did bathe, just not as often as we might hope. Public bathhouses were surprisingly popular in early medieval Europe, especially before the Black Death. Some were even social centers, with food, music, and occasionally more extracurricular activities. But after the plague of 1348, everything changed. People began to associate bathhouses with disease. The warm, steamy air was thought to spread infection. And since doctors believed that warm water opened the pores and let bad air in, bathing started to seem like a very risky hobby. Instead, they invented a new form of cleanliness: dry hygiene. You could stay clean by rubbing yourself with linen, brushing your hair, and changing shirts. Soap was for clothes, not for skin, so instead of bathing, people covered the smell. Perfumed oils, herbs, and scented gloves became the medieval equivalent of deodorant. The nobility, of course, could afford much better smells than everyone else. A peasant might sprinkle vinegar on their hands. A noble might carry a gilded pomander filled with ambergris, a fragrant substance produced in the intestines of whales. Yes, whale vomit. It was basically the Chanel No. 5 of the Middle Ages. Smell is status. Your smell said a lot about who you were. The poor smelled like labor. The rich smelled like money, and the things money could mask. A medieval noble was expected to exude a pleasant fragrance, not just because it was nicer, but because scent was tied to morality. good smell equaled goodness itself. Ladies perfumed their gloves and handkerchiefs with violet, rose, or cinnamon. Men might favor musk, civet, or amber, all of which, unprocessed, smell disturbingly like the animals they come from. But once diluted and aged, they became the essence of sophistication. When nobles traveled, they brought their scents with them. Rosewater, herbs, even portable braziers for burning incense. They didn't just want to smell good. They wanted to overwrite the world's odors with their own. A fragrant declaration of hierarchy. Of course, this did little to help the lower classes, who were still wading through the combined emissions of humanity and livestock, but at least someone smelled nice. The perfumed city. It's worth noting that smell wasn't always. Bad medieval cities could be fragrant, too. Briefly. Markets were filled with the scents of fresh herbs, spiced wine, and roasted meat. Churches glowed with incense. Lavender hung from rafters to repel moths. And medieval people loved flowers, not just for beauty, but for survival. They scattered petals on floors to mask the stench of mud and animals. Certain herbs, like rue and wormwood, were thought to cleanse the air and drive out evil spirits, which, conveniently, smelled exactly like bad hygiene. Monasteries cultivated herb gardens specifically for fragrance. The monks didn't just grow mint and sage for cooking, but also for purifying the air during long, enclosed prayers. You could almost call it medieval aromatherapy, though with slightly more Latin chanting. A brief interlude. The medieval nose job smell didn't only affect how people felt, it shaped architecture. The medieval home was designed to cope with odor in its own strange way. Houses were smoky from cooking fires and hearths, but that smoke actually helped cover up worse smells, also acted as a primitive disinfectant. So the phrase "smoke gets in your eyes" was probably less of a complaint and more of a survival mechanism. Windows were small, ventilation poor, and chimneys optional. The result was a sort of olfactory soup, a cozy, smoky, slightly fetid environment that most medieval people would have described as homey. If you were rich, you might hang herbs or tapestries soaked in rose water. If you were poor, you relied on the natural deodorant of wind. And if you were a medieval doctor, you prescribed aromatic posies, literally little bouquets to sniff in dangerous company. The 14th century version of holding your sleeve over your nose on the subway. Death, disease, and the fragrance of fear. The plague changed how people thought about smell forever. When the Black Death struck Europe, it wasn't just the death toll that terrified people. It was the smell of it. Rotting corpses, unwashed bodies, burning pitch. Cities reeked of panic. People carried pomanders filled with strong herbs, rosemary, thyme, camphor, anything to ward off the pestilential air. Doctors even designed special beaked masks filled with perfume to protect themselves. They didn't stop the disease, but they did make dying slightly more fragrant. In some places, entire city quarters were burned to cleanse the bee. Air officials spread vinegar on walls and sprinkled rosewater in churches. They even forbade certain trades, like tanning and butchery, from operating within city limits. Not out of compassion, but out of self-preservation. Because in the medieval mind, smell was the bridge between the body and the soul. To breathe corruption was to invite it inside. And so, in a strange way, the battle against bad smells was the beginning of public health. The everyday art of not gagging. Let's drift for a moment into the smaller details. The daily habits that made medieval life bearable. Medieval people were not oblivious to bad smells. They just accepted them as part of the background. Like traffic noise today, you noticed it only when it stopped. To cope, they burned incense, boiled herbs, sprinkled vinegar, and carried handkerchiefs soaked in perfume. During feasts, fresh rushes or herbs were spread across the floor, partly to absorb spills, partly to mask odors. They were changed every few days. Theoretically, in practice, they often became part of the smell problem themselves. Towns employed scavengers to clean the streets. Men paid to remove animal carcasses, waste, and whatever else accumulated in public spaces. But they worked slowly, and by the time they arrived, the air was already heavy with what one chronicler called the perfume of corruption. What did people smell like in the Middle Ages? Really? Tonight, we're drifting back to a world before soap dispensers, before hot showers, and long before anyone said the phrase, "I can't start my day without deodorant." So, get comfortable, dim the lights a bit, maybe light a candle. Preferably something that doesn't smell like tallow or burning cabbage. And let's wander together through one of the most quietly fascinating questions in all of human history. What did people smell like in the Middle Ages? Really? Because we've all heard it, haven't we? That medieval people never bathed, that castles reeked, that peasants wallowed in filth and nobles powdered themselves to disguise the stench. But is any of that actually true? The answer, as with most things in history, is somewhere between worse than you'd expect and not quite as horrifying as you've been told. So, let's begin. Softly, and with as little judgment as possible, by taking a deep, imaginary breath of the 14th century. Try not to flinch. The smell of a medieval town. Let's start outside, because that's where most people lived their lives. In villages and towns that were small, crowded, and, well, biologically active. If you walked through the streets of a medieval town, your nose would have been your most immediate companion. It was a whole sensory landscape. There was the smell of smoke, not unpleasant at first, the scent of countless fires burning peat, wood, or whatever fuel people could find. Then came the tang of manure, because livestock wandered the streets freely, and horses did what horses do. Add to that the sour, yeasty aroma of beer brewing in someone's kitchen, the rich salt of drying fish, and the unmistakable, nose-wrinkling presence of human waste tossed casually into the gutter. Now, it's easy to be smug about that from our modern, perfumed world. But remember, to them, that was normal. The smell of a town was a familiar tapestry, full of information. You could tell which quarter you were in by scent alone. The tanner's district, sharp, acrid, full of soaked hides and rotting flesh. The baker's alley, sweet and smoky. The fish market, self-explanatory, and best avoided on warm days. And this wasn't. Dirty in the moral. Since it's often portrayed, it was just life. People didn't walk around gagging at the smell of their own town. They were used to it. Much. Like modern city dwellers, don't really notice car exhaust until they visit the countryside. Bathing, or the lack thereof. Let's wander indoors now, carefully, and talk about bathing, because this is where the myths really start to smell off. Contrary to popular belief, medieval Europeans did bathe. They didn't necessarily bathe daily, or even weekly, but they were not allergic to water. In fact, public bathhouses were surprisingly common across medieval Europe, especially from the 12th to the early 15th centuries. These weren't grimy dungeons either. They were lively, social spaces, part spa, part tavern, part potential scandal. You could pay for a wooden tub, a towel, and sometimes a companion. Of course, that last detail was what eventually got them shut down. By the late 15th century, as the church became increasingly nervous about public morality, and, later, about syphilis, bathhouses fell out of favor. But before that, people did soak themselves quite happily. At home, if you couldn't afford a bathhouse, you might wash at the hearth with a bucket of warm water, a linen cloth, and a dab of lye soap. Homemade, harsh, and definitely not pH balanced. Nobles, who had the luxury of servants and more privacy, sometimes bathed in wooden tubs lined with linen. Hot water would be poured in from cauldrons, and herbs like chamomile, rosemary, or sage were tossed in for fragrance, and because it sounded vaguely medicinal. So, no, people didn't go their entire lives without washing. But, and this is where modern noses begin to wrinkle again, they did smell different. Because while water was available, laundry was difficult, deodorant didn't exist, and soap was not something you'd want to lather your body with too often. It stripped the skin and left you smelling faintly of ash and animal fat. The cleanest people in the Middle Ages. Interestingly, some of the cleanest medieval people were not European at all, or at least not Western European. In the Islamic world, cleanliness was both a practical and religious duty. Cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo had public baths, running water, and a deep cultural respect for personal hygiene centuries before most of Europe. Travelers from Christian Europe were often amazed and occasionally scandalized at how frequently Muslims washed. In fact, when Crusaders arrived in the Holy Land, they were sometimes mocked by the locals for their smell. Imagine showing up to a war and realizing your enemies thought you stank. It wasn't a great look for Christendom. Hair, skin, and the medieval glow. Now, let's drift to something more intimate, the body itself. hair was rarely washed with soap. It was more likely rinsed with water or vinegar, brushed with oils or powders, or simply covered with a headdress. Women, in particular, took great care to braid and perfume their hair, using lavender, sage, or rose petals. When available, men often wore hats, hoods, or coifs, which kept their hair cleanish, though also slightly musty. And the skin? Medieval beauty ideals didn't prize a tan. Pale skin was a sign of leisure and nobility, so noble women went to great lengths to keep their faces fair, sometimes literally whitening them with mixtures of vinegar and lead. Yes, lead. It gave the complexion a ghostly glow, and eventually several chronic health problems. But at least you looked fashionably sick. Moisturizers were simple concoctions of animal fat, beeswax or almond oil. They didn't smell bad, per se, just earthy. The kind of smell that says, I live in a castle, and my moisturizer is technically edible. The smell of nobility speaking. Of castles. Let's talk about the people who lived in them. Royal and noble households smelled different from peasant cottages, but not necessarily better. They were full of animals, hunting dogs, falcons, horses, and people. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, all living close together in rooms that were rarely aired out. Candles made of beeswax were expensive, so tallow, rendered animal fat, was common. It gave off a smoky, greasy scent that clung to everything. Add to that the smell of damp stone, unwashed wool, burning peat, and the faintly tragic aroma of whatever the cook was over-boiling downstairs. And you begin to see why medieval castles were more atmospheric than aromatic. Nobles tried to mask these scents with herbs and flowers. Rushes, those long, grassy plants, were strewn on the floors and changed periodically. They were sometimes mixed with lavender, mint, or meadowsweet. The idea was that the pleasant smell of herbs would disguise the less pleasant smell of people. In practice, it created a sort of olfactory tug-of-war between the two. And yet, by the standards of their time, the nobility were quite clean. They washed their hands before and after meals, a point of etiquette. They owned combs, mirrors, and perfumes. They changed their linen regularly, because linen, unlike wool or fur, could be boiled clean. In fact, many medieval people believed that wearing clean linen next to the skin was a form of cleanliness. It absorbed sweat and oils, and if you changed it often, you'd feel refreshed without ever touching water. A sort of early, textile-based hygiene philosophy. The peasant's perfume. Meanwhile, down in the villages, the average peasant's scent was less, layered. They worked outdoors. They sweated. Their homes were one-room cottages with open hearths and thatched roofs. Everything smelled faintly of smoke, which, conveniently, masked the smell of humans. Bathing was done when possible, often in rivers or with buckets. Soap was homemade from lye and fat, and used sparingly. Clothing was washed occasionally, and usually only the outer layers. Still, peasants weren't oblivious. They valued cleanliness in their own way. They swept their homes, washed their hands in basins, and often used herbs to freshen clothing. A sprig of rosemary tucked into a sleeve could work wonders. And because they lived closer to nature, they probably smelled more like animals, smoke, and soil, but less like stagnant air and perfume gone sour. The fragrance of faith religion also played a curious role in medieval scent culture. For monks and nuns, cleanliness was associated with purity, but also with humility. Excessive grooming could be seen as vanity, but filth was frowned upon too. The ideal was a quiet, moderate cleanliness, washing the hands, the face, and occasionally the feet, but avoiding ostentatious bathing. Monasteries had washing troughs, and many kept herbal gardens filled with plants like lavender, sage, and mint, partly for medicine, partly for scent, and, of course, churches themselves smelled divine. Literally. The air was thick with incense, beeswax candles, and the faint metallic tang of centuries of stone and devotion. If you've ever walked into an old cathedral and thought, "This smells ancient," you're not wrong. It's the smell of centuries of worship and wax, an aroma somewhere between holiness and dust. The scent of death, and then there was death, a scent no medieval person could avoid. Plagues, wars, and the general fragility of life meant that death was a constant neighbor. Burials were common within city limits, often near churches, and the air of a medieval cemetery, especially in summer, was unmistakable. But even this became part of daily life. People didn't recoil in horror at every unpleasant smell. How did medieval people deal with bad smells? The fragrance of civilization. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before soap was a household. What happened to the eunuchs who outlived their emperors? The quiet survivors of power, hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the echoing marble corridors of palaces long gone. The air is heavy with incense and secrets, the sound of silk shoes on polished floors, and somewhere in the background, a eunuch, quiet, pale, slightly stooped, is watching everything. He's been doing that for 40 years. Because tonight's story isn't about the kings who made laws, or the queens who broke them. It's about the men who made it possible for those rulers to function, the imperial eunuchs. And more importantly, what happened to them when the emperors they served finally stopped functioning. It's a strange little corner of history, quiet, tragic, and sometimes darkly funny, because for every emperor who lived like a god, there was usually a eunuch nearby who knew exactly how human that god really was. And when the god died, someone had to clean up the mess. So let's drift back to a time when losing your masculinity could make you the most powerful man in the empire. And when surviving your emperor was, quite possibly, the worst thing that could happen to you. The deal of a lifetime, or a shortened one first. Let's clear something up. Nobody volunteered to become a eunuch. Not really. Sure, there were a few who claimed it was for career advancement, But that's a bit like saying you amputated your leg for the sake of better job mobility. It was usually done to them. In the great empires, Byzantine, Chinese, Ottoman, the practice was the same in spirit, if not in detail. Take a boy, usually poor, sometimes enslaved. Remove the parts of him that would one day make him a threat. Raise him near the palace, feed him just enough, and teach him how to serve. It sounds horrifying, and it was. But within that horror was a strange form of social mobility. Because once inside the palace walls, these men, or rather, these official neither men, could rise higher than almost anyone else. They were the only servants allowed into the emperor's private chambers. They handled imperial documents, royal finances, and sometimes royal secrets of a more intimate nature. And emperors liked them precisely because they couldn't form dynasties. They couldn't have sons, or families, or rival claims. They could be trusted, in theory. In practice, that trust often ended badly. Because if there's one thing worse than an emperor with absolute power, it's a eunuch who knows how to use it. The Byzantine way. Faith, politics, and gossip, let's start in Constantinople. The city that had everything. Gold mosaics, theological arguments, and a mild obsession with stabbing one another in corridors. The Byzantine Empire was absolutely full of eunuchs. They were in the treasury, the church, the army, even the imperial bedroom. Some were deeply pious. Others were deeply corrupt. Most, somehow, were both. One of the earliest famous ones was Eutropius, who served Emperor Arcadius around the year 400. Eutropius began as a slave, rose through the ranks, and became the Praepositus Sacri Cubiculi, the fancy Latin term for head of the sacred bedchamber, which, yes, basically meant the emperor's roommate. He controlled who got to see the emperor. He controlled appointments. He even arranged imperial marriages, including Arcadius's own. Naturally, everyone hated him for it. Eutropius enjoyed a few years of obscene power. He was showered with titles, bribes, and maybe a few curses. But when Arcadius's wife, Eudoxia, decided she'd had enough of being advised by her husband's favorite eunuch, she did what Byzantines did best. She whispered. Then she schemed. Then she had him executed. It was the Byzantine version of unfriending. Someone, only slightly more final. Eutropius's story set the tone for many eunuchs to come. They rose high, served loyally, and then, when power shifted, they fell faster than a dropped reliquary. But for the ones who didn't get executed immediately, there came the strange limbo. What does a man do when his emperor dies, and the next one doesn't want him around? He retires quietly into a monastery, if he's lucky, because monasteries were full of eunuchs. They couldn't marry anyway, and they were already used to obedience, silence, and bad food. It was, in many ways, a natural career pivot. So when you read of an old monk in Byzantium who just happens to advise half the imperial court, chances are he wasn't always that pious. The ones who stayed too long, of course. Not every eunuch went quietly. Some, like Joseph Bringas, tried to play politics even after their emperor's death. Bringas had been the power behind Emperor Romanos II. In the 10th century, running the empire while the young emperor spent most of his time drinking and, according to sources, exercising his appetites. When Romanos died suddenly and suspiciously, Bringas tried to hold on. It didn't go well. The Empress Theophano, who was widely suspected of poisoning her husband and possibly several others, decided Bringas was inconvenient. A mob was sent after him. He fled, disguised himself as a priest, and spent his remaining years doing the Byzantine version of hiding under a blanket, writing bitter letters and pretending to be holy. Bringas lived, but as many eunuchs discovered, surviving your emperor meant surviving your usefulness, and often your wealth, your dignity, and your carefully built identity. They had no heirs to carry their names, no families to defend them. Once the emperor was gone, they were ghosts in silk, robes. The forbidden men of China, let's drift further east now, to the forbidden city of Ming and Qing. China, a palace so vast and silent that even the echoes were afraid to speak too loudly. Chinese eunuchs had perhaps the most infamous reputation of all. They were the keepers of imperial concubines, the administrators of the palace, and, according to every Confucian scholar ever, the root cause of every dynasty's decline, which seems unfair when emperors ignored their duties to focus on calligraphy. Someone had to keep the place running. But yes, many eunuchs did abuse their positions. They became fabulously rich, sometimes ruling the empire from behind the screen, as it were. And when their emperor died, things got complicated. The Chinese court had rules for everything, including what to do with a eunuch who'd just lost his master. Technically, he was supposed to retire to a eunuch retirement home. Yes, those existed. To spend his last days sweeping courtyards and chanting sutras. In practice, a few took their ill-gotten wealth and vanished into the provinces. Others were executed as scapegoats for whatever went wrong in the previous reign, because, conveniently, a eunuch could be blamed for nearly anything. Zheng He, the exception. That floated, of course. There was one very famous exception. Zheng He, the great admiral of the Ming treasure fleets. He was castrated at 11 after being captured by imperial troops, which sounds like a terrible way to start a life, and yet somehow became one of the most powerful men in the world. He commanded hundreds of ships, thousands of sailors, and sailed as far as East Africa. He brought back exotic animals, ambassadors, and one particularly confused giraffe. But when Emperor Yongle died, Zheng He's fate became uncertain. The next emperor wasn't a fan of expensive naval adventures, so Zheng was quietly sidelined. He made one last voyage, possibly more symbolic than real, and when he died at sea, his sailors buried him in the waves. His tomb in Nanjing is empty. A cenotaph for a man who lived grandly, served loyally, and died without a family to mourn him. In a way, it's fitting. The sea became his heir. The problem of outliving a god to outlive an emperor was, in essence, to lose your entire reason for existing. Your life, your power, your daily rhythm, all of it revolved around one person. When that person died, so did your purpose. Imagine spending 40 years making sure someone's slippers were warm, their concubines discreet, and their tea slightly less fatal than usual, only to be told, "We don't need you anymore." Some eunuchs tried to attach themselves to the next ruler. Some managed it. Briefly, others were exiled, or worse, and a few chose the more theatrical route, suicide in a gesture of loyalty. The Ming court recorded several eunuchs who slit their throats at their master's funeral, insisting they'd follow him to serve in the afterlife. One suspects they'd simply run out of better options. The Ottoman silence. Let's drift west again, to Istanbul. The Ottoman court also employed eunuchs, thousands of them. The two most important factions were the black eunuchs, who guarded the harem, and the white eunuchs, who served the outer palace. They were often slaves from Africa or the Balkans, brought as children, and trained into a life of ritual, discipline, and silence. When a sultan died, his harem was sealed. The concubines were either married off or sent to a special old palace to fade, quietly into memory. The eunuchs who served, them went too. Their careers ended with the reign they'd served. Some, however, rose astonishingly high. One of them, Kuzlar Agha, the chief black eunuch, controlled access to the Sultan's mother, and through her, much of the empire. When he outlived a sultan, he could be reassigned, but more often he was quietly replaced. No scandal, no trial, just a polite disappearance. By the 19th century, the Ottomans began phasing out eunuchs altogether. Modernity, it seemed, required fewer castrated middle managers. The sad aftermath. Across all empires, the pattern repeated. Eunuchs outlived their masters. They retired to monasteries, shrines, small estates. What did people smell like in the Middle Ages? Really? Tonight, we're drifting back to a world before soap dispensers, before hot showers, and long before anyone said the phrase, "I can't start my day without deodorant." So, get comfortable, dim the lights a bit, maybe light a candle. Preferably something that doesn't smell like tallow or burning cabbage. And let's wander together through one of the most quietly fascinating questions in all of human history. What did people smell like in the Middle Ages? Really? Because we've all heard it, haven't we? That medieval people never bathed, that castles reeked, that peasants wallowed in filth and nobles powdered themselves to disguise the stench. But is any of that actually true? The answer, as with most things in history, is somewhere between worse than you'd expect and not quite as horrifying as you've been told. So, let's begin. Softly, and with as little judgment as possible, by taking a deep, imaginary breath of the 14th century. try not to flinch. The smell of a medieval town. Let's start outside, because that's where most people lived their lives. In villages and towns that were small, crowded, and, well, biologically active. If you walked through the streets of a medieval town, your nose would have been your most immediate companion. It was a whole sensory landscape. There was the smell of smoke, not unpleasant. At first, the scent of countless fires burning peat, wood, or whatever fuel people could find. Then came the tang of manure, because livestock wandered the streets freely, and horses did what horses do. Add to that the sour, yeasty aroma of beer brewing in someone's kitchen, the rich salt of drying fish, and the unmistakable, nose-wrinkling presence of human waste tossed casually into the gutter. Now, it's easy to be smug about that from our modern, perfumed world. But remember, to them, that was normal. The smell of a town was a familiar tapestry, full of information. You could tell which quarter you were in by scent alone. The tanner's district, sharp, acrid, full of soaked hides and rotting flesh. The baker's alley, sweet and smoky. The fish market, self-explanatory, and best avoided on warm days. And this wasn't. Dirty in the moral. Since it's often portrayed, it was just life. People didn't walk around gagging at the smell of their own town. They were used to it. Much. Like modern city dwellers, don't really notice car exhaust until they visit the countryside. Bathing, or the lack thereof. Let's wander indoors now, carefully, and talk about bathing, because this is where the myths really start to smell off. Contrary to popular belief, medieval Europeans did bathe. They didn't necessarily bathe daily, or even weekly, but they were not allergic to water. In fact, public bathhouses were surprisingly common across medieval Europe, especially from the 12th to the early 15th centuries. These weren't grimy dungeons either. They were lively, social spaces, part spa, part tavern, part potential scandal. You could pay for a wooden tub, a towel, and sometimes a companion. Of course, that last detail was what eventually got them shut down. By the late 15th century, as the church became increasingly nervous about public morality, and, later, about syphilis, bathhouses fell out of favor. But before that, people did soak themselves quite happily. At home, if you couldn't afford a bathhouse, you might wash at the hearth with a bucket of warm water, a linen cloth, and a dab of lye soap. Homemade, harsh, and definitely not pH balanced. Nobles, who had the luxury of servants and more privacy, sometimes bathed in wooden tubs lined with linen. Hot water would be poured in from cauldrons, and herbs like chamomile, rosemary, or sage were tossed in for fragrance, and because it sounded vaguely medicinal. So, no, people didn't go their entire lives without washing. But, and this is where modern noses begin to wrinkle again, they did smell different. Because while water was available, laundry was difficult, deodorant didn't exist, and soap was not something you'd want to lather your body with too often. It stripped the skin and left you smelling faintly of ash and animal fat. The cleanest people in the Middle Ages. Interestingly, some of the cleanest medieval people were not European at all, or at least not Western European. In the Islamic world, cleanliness was both a practical and religious duty. Cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo had public baths, running water, and a deep cultural respect for personal hygiene centuries before most of Europe. Travelers from Christian Europe were often amazed and occasionally scandalized at how frequently Muslims washed. In fact, when Crusaders arrived in the Holy Land, they were sometimes mocked by the locals for their smell. Imagine showing up to a war and realizing your enemies thought you stank. It wasn't a great look for Christendom. Hair, skin, and the medieval glow. Now, let's drift to something more intimate. The body itself. Hair was rarely washed with soap. It was more likely rinsed with water or vinegar, brushed with oils or powders, or simply covered with a headdress. Women, in particular, took great care to braid and perfume their hair, using lavender, sage, or rose petals. When available, men often wore hats, hoods, or coifs, which kept their hair cleanish, though also slightly musty. And the skin? Medieval beauty ideals didn't prize a tan. Pale skin was a sign of leisure and nobility, so noble women went to great lengths to keep their faces fair, sometimes literally whitening them with mixtures of vinegar and lead. Yes, lead. It gave the complexion a ghostly glow, and eventually several chronic health problems. But at least you looked fashionably sick. Moisturizers were simple concoctions of animal fat, beeswax or almond oil. They didn't smell bad, per se, just earthy. The kind of smell that says, I live in a castle, and my moisturizer is technically edible. The smell of nobility speaking. Of castles. Let's talk about the people who lived in them. Royal and noble households smelled different from peasant cottages, but not necessarily better. They were full of animals, hunting dogs, falcons, horses, and people. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, all living close together in rooms that were rarely aired out. Candles made of beeswax were expensive, so tallow, rendered animal fat, was common. It gave off a smoky, greasy scent that clung to everything. Add to that the smell of damp stone, unwashed wool, burning peat, and the faintly tragic aroma of whatever the cook was over-boiling downstairs, and you begin to see why medieval castles were more atmospheric than aromatic. Nobles tried to mask these scents with herbs and flowers. Rushes, those long, grassy plants, were strewn on the floors and changed periodically. They were sometimes mixed with lavender, mint, or meadowsweet. The idea was that the pleasant smell of herbs would disguise the less pleasant smell of people. In practice, it created a sort of olfactory tug-of-war between the two, and yet, by the standards of their time, the nobility were quite clean. They washed their hands before and after meals, a point of etiquette. They owned combs, mirrors, and perfumes. They changed their linen regularly, because linen, unlike wool or fur, could be boiled clean. In fact, many medieval people believed that wearing clean linen next to the skin was a form of cleanliness. It absorbed sweat and oils, and if you changed it often, you'd feel refreshed without ever touching water. A sort of early, textile-based hygiene philosophy. The peasant's perfume. Meanwhile, down in the villages, the average peasant's scent was less, layered. They worked outdoors. They sweated. Their homes were one-room cottages with open hearths and thatched roofs. Everything smelled faintly of smoke, which, conveniently, masked the smell of humans. Bathing was done when possible, often in rivers or with buckets. Soap was homemade from lye and fat, and used sparingly. Clothing was washed occasionally, and usually only the outer layers. Still, peasants weren't oblivious. They valued cleanliness in their own way. They swept their homes, washed their hands in basins, and often used herbs to freshen clothing. A sprig of rosemary tucked into a sleeve could work wonders. And because they lived closer to nature, they probably smelled more like animals, smoke, and soil, but less like stagnant air and perfume gone sour. The fragrance of faith religion also played a curious role in medieval scent culture. For monks and nuns, cleanliness was associated with purity, but also with humility. Excessive grooming could be seen as vanity, but filth was frowned upon too. The ideal was a quiet, moderate cleanliness, washing the hands, the face, and occasionally the feet, but avoiding ostentatious bathing. Monasteries had washing troughs, and many kept herbal gardens filled with plants like lavender, sage, and mint, partly for medicine, partly for scent, and, of course, churches themselves smelled divine. Literally. The air was thick with incense, beeswax candles, and the faint metallic tang of centuries of stone and devotion. If you've ever walked into an old cathedral and thought, "This smells ancient," you're not wrong. It's the smell of centuries of worship and wax, an aroma somewhere between holiness and dust. The scent of death, and then there was death, a scent no medieval person could avoid. Plagues, wars, and the general fragility of life meant that death was a constant neighbor. Burials were common within city limits, often near churches, and the air of a medieval cemetery, especially in summer, was unmistakable. But even this became part of daily life. People didn't recoil in horror at every unpleasant smell. How did medieval people really smell? The aroma of the ages. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back into a world without soap ads. A world where perfume meant survival, and where people believed that water, yes, water, could kill you. So, get comfortable. Maybe light a candle. Maybe not, because tonight's story is about scent, the kind that lingers in tapestries, under armor, in the folds of velvet, and in the noses of everyone who's ever tried to romanticize the Middle Ages. We're going to talk about what medieval people really smelled like. And the answer, as you might expect, is complicated, not because they were especially disgusting, though yes, there's some of that. But because clean itself meant something very different. The medieval knows first. Let's set the scene. You wake up in the year 1350. You're in a thatched house in a small English village. There's no running water, of course, and no sense that you're missing it. The hearth is burning peat, or maybe cow dung if it's been a bad winter. The air tastes like smoke, damp wool, and slightly hopeful cabbage. That smell, that's home. Now, the first thing to know about medieval smell is that everyone smelled together. Body odor wasn't an individual failing. It was just background noise, like birdsong, or taxes. Cleanliness didn't mean freshly showered. It meant morally clean. And that meant keeping your soul pure, your clothes orderly, and your face vaguely rinsed, if the weather allowed. The rest was in God's hands. Baths. The sin of getting too comfortable. Let's start with baths. Because whenever people imagine medieval stench, they picture unwashed peasants who'd never seen a tub. But actually, medieval people did bathe, just not the way we would. In early medieval Europe, bathhouses were surprisingly common. Romans had left behind their love of communal bathing, and medieval towns built their own versions, small, steamy, cheerful places where people would sit in wooden tubs and gossip. They even served food and wine. Sometimes it got a little more social than the church liked, which naturally meant the church decided to ruin it. By the 14th century, moral reformers had decided that bathhouses were dens of sin, because, as it turns out, people in hot water tend to remove clothing, and apparently that was enough to risk eternal damnation. So, public baths declined, but private washing, small-scale, practical washing, continued. People still scrubbed their faces, hands, and feet. Medieval advice books even recommended washing your hands before and after meals, cleaning your teeth with linen cloths, and combing your hair daily. Not exactly medieval filth, is it? Still, few dared to soak their entire body in water regularly. Why? Because many doctors believed it could make you sick. Water, they thought, opened the pores and let in bad air. Miasma and miasma in medieval medicine was practically a murder weapon. So bathing was a delicate art, good for a quick rinse, but dangerous if you overdid it, like medieval skydiving. The hierarchy of hygiene now, the rich did smell a little different, mostly because they could afford to hide it. They wore layers of fine linen, which could be changed and washed far more easily than wool or velvet. And linen absorbed sweat rather heroically. So if you were wealthy, you didn't necessarily smell less. You just outsourced your odor to your undergarments. There's a famous medieval saying, "Change your shirt, and you've bathed." And, in fairness, if your servants were doing the laundry, that was as close to bathing as most nobles got. Speaking of laundry, It was a nightmare. No soap as we know it, just lye, ashes, and elbow grease. And medieval lye soap was a choice. It could burn your skin, bleach your fabrics, and generally make you question your life decisions. So clothing was washed sparingly. As for the lower classes, they didn't have linen to spare, but they did bathe in rivers and wash their faces daily. Chronic filth was a city problem, not a rural one. In the countryside, you smelled like hay, earth, and animals. In cities, you smelled like humanity, which is to say, not great, cities that could kill you by smell alone. If you ever find yourself time-traveling, you'll notice that medieval towns reeked. But it wasn't necessarily people who were the problem. It was everything else. Let's drift into 14th century London. The streets are narrow, dark, and perpetually damp. The Thames is both a water source and a sewer. You can buy eels fished out of it in the morning, and then dump your chamber pot back into it at night. Recycling, medieval style, animal carcasses hang outside butcher shops. Rotting vegetables pile up in corners, and tanners, the people who make leather, soak hides in vats of urine. Yes, literal urine. It was used to loosen the hair and fat from animal skins, which meant entire neighborhoods smelled like, well, that. And if that wasn't enough, butchers also dumped entrails and blood right into the gutters. So, a nice walk through town was less stroll through, history, and more nose-based endurance trial. City officials did try to clean things up occasionally. They passed ordinances against dumping filth in the streets, but enforcement was, let's say, flexible. The kind of law you obey only when someone important is watching. There were even scavengers, early street cleaners, who shoveled waste into pits outside the city. But those pits filled quickly, and the smell drifted back. By summer, the air was thick enough to chew. Perfume, powder, and denial. So, how did the rich deal with it? By covering it up, of course. Perfume was everywhere. Not just to smell nice, but to ward off disease, because again, people thought illness traveled through bad air. So smelling pleasant wasn't vanity, it was medicine. Ladies carried pomanders, small metal spheres filled with herbs, spices, or ambergris, which, just to ruin your day, comes from whale intestines. They wore them around their necks or tucked them into sleeves. Men might carry small scented cloths or wear gloves, perfumed with rose water. The air itself could be treated. In sick rooms, people burned rosemary, juniper, or vinegar. Soaked sponges, doctors wore beaked masks filled with flowers and herbs, not to look fashionable, but to survive. And yes, people perfumed themselves. Too, they washed with scented waters, like lavender or orange blossom, or wiped down with vinegar and linen. Essentially, medieval dry shampoo, but for your entire existence. Queen Elizabeth II, centuries later, was said to have taken a bath once a month, whether she needed it or not, which sounds horrifying until you remember that her linen gowns, ruffs, and sleeves were changed daily, and probably soaked in floral waters. She may have smelled like dusty violets and anxiety, which, honestly, fits the monastic exception now. While the nobility perfumed their way through life, monks were taking a different approach entirely, one that could generously be described as minimal. Medieval monks weren't exactly forbidden to bathe, but they were strongly discouraged. Cleanliness, after all, risked pride, and pride was worse than smell. So monasteries often limited baths to a few times a year. Easter, Christmas, and maybe if something had exploded. But monks did wash their hands and faces, and they kept their clothes relatively clean. The Benedictine rule even specified that laundry should be done regularly, because even God didn't want to sit next to that smell during prayers. Yet, over time, this became a point of pride. Some ascetics deliberately avoided washing as a form of holiness, suffering through their own stink as proof of devotion. By all accounts, the saints were fragrant in spirit, but less so in body. There's a 13th century record of St. Thomas, Becket's tunic being washed after his martyrdom, and the water turned black. The monks considered it miraculous. Others might have considered it overdue. A world of layers now. It's worth remembering that medieval people didn't experience smell the way we do. They lived surrounded by it, the constant hum of wood smoke, animal dung, and humanity. To them, that was normal. It was the smell of life, not filth. When modern people visit reconstructed medieval towns, they often describe the air as heavy. It's not just dirt, it's density. The mix of sweat, tallow candles, beer, and unventilated living. It's intimate. In a strange way, everyone carried their environment with them, and people were astonishingly good at identifying smells. They knew the scent of diseases, of food spoilage, of stormy weather. Doctors diagnosed illnesses by breath. Wine tasters were called in to test barrels for taint. A good nose could be a career. So while, yes, the average person probably smelled earthy or pungent, depending on the day, it wasn't filth to them. It was familiarity. The royal nose still. Even kings couldn't escape it. Imagine Henry VIII, sweating through his velvet and fur, surrounded by courtiers drenched in musk and rosewater, standing in a palace that was also a public latrine. Because, that's the other thing, castles didn't have plumbing as we'd think of it. They had garderobes, stone closets with a hole in the bench that dropped straight into a pit. Sometimes that pit overflowed. Sometimes servants had to climb in to shovel it out. Imagine that job description. Assistant groom of the stool. Henry actually had a groom of the stool, a man whose entire purpose was to assist the king during bathroom visits. It was considered an honor. He had the king's ear. among other things, but the castles themselves reeked. Rushes on the floor absorbed spills, grease, and the occasional mouse corpse, even with herbs scattered among them. Lavender, sage, sweet flag. The smell was mixed.